So in my paper, I discussed the question of Roman Ingarden's influences on the Lvov-Warsaw school by exploring selected topics present in Leopold Blaustein's writings. Blaustein was a student as well as a critic, continuator, and interpretator of Ingarden's philosophy. At the same time, Blaustein, who was educated by Twardowski, is regarded as a member of the Lvov-Warsaw school. My ultimate aim here is to define these elements of Blaustein's theory, which seem to be rooted in polemics and critiques of Ingarden. The reason for juxtaposing both philosophies has, first of all, a historical nature and refers to our biographies of both thinkers. Let me first shed more light on these biographies. Ingarden began his studies in Lvov in 1911, yet after one semester, he decided to move to Göttingen, where he joined lectures held by Husserl. Later, already in Freiburg in Breisgau in 1918, Ingarden defended his doctoral dissertation on Bergson. In 1925, Ingarden published his habilitation thesis on the existential questions, and he began his job at the John Casimir University in Lvov. There he held classes on the literary work of art, and in the 30s, he held a seminar on aesthetics, which concerned the phenomenology of aesthetic experience. While being in Lvov in 1925, Ingarden met a 12 years younger talented student, Blaustein. Blaustein, just as Ingarden before him, had an occasion to study directly under Husserl, since he spent a summer semester of 1925 in Freiburg. With the supervision of Twardowski, he defended a doctoral dissertation on Husserl's theory of the act and content. On the basis of his early account of Husserl's theory, Blaustein developed later original studies on aesthetic experience as a whole, composed of so-called imaginative presentations. In the 30s, he examined different phenomena of aesthetic experience, including the phenomenon of listening to the radio, watching a movie in a cinema or a theater play. Since 1925, until Blaustein's death, he met Ingarden very often, and they held a permanent philosophical discussion. Importantly, Blaustein joined Ingarden's classes and participated in this aesthetics seminar as well. Given the similarity of discussed topics, it should come as no surprise that in the secondary literature one finds a thesis that Blaustein was influenced by Ingarden. It is beyond any doubt that Blaustein formulated his original philosophy in a permanent dialogue as well as in polemic with Ingarden. Yet the question to what extent this dialogue and polemic shaped Blaustein's theory remains open. In this paper, I will defend a thesis that these influences are not limited to aesthetics and reach other topics as well. To show this, at the beginning, I addressed the question whether is it justified to call Blaustein an analytic phenomenologist, and if so, to what extent one has to understand this label. Next, I present the critique of eidetic phenomenology, which was formulated by Blaustein in the same time as he began his research on aesthetics. Then I discussed basics of Blaustein analysis of Husserl's theory of content. In doing so, I suggest that the main argument against the theory Blaustein borrowed from Ingarden and his analysis of sensations in lived experiences. Because of time limits and given the topic of the last paper presented by Aleksandra Horecka, I will omit in the present paper a juxtaposition of the aesthetic theories developed by both philosophers. So part one, Blaustein as an analytic phenomenologist. As already stated, Blaustein was educated by philosophers who present different philosophical traditions. This fact may suggest that the Polish philosopher was influenced by those traditions, and for this reason he did link divergent approaches and use various methods. This suggestion leads some scholars to call Blaustein an analytic phenomenologist. But one may ask, what does it mean that someone is an analytic phenomenologist? This classification is based mainly on historical philosophical arguments. Jan Woleński, for instance, calls Blaustein a precursor of analytic phenomenology, which ought to consist in connecting ideas of Twardowski and Husserl. Yet, the description is too vague, since one does not get any knowledge of either which particular ideas of both philosophers are to be connected, nor what this connection supposed to mean. If one refers in this context, say, to the problem of content in Husserl, it is the topic of Blaustein's doctoral dissertation and Twardowski's habilitation thesis, this would suggest that any attempt to interpret Husserl's theory of content has Twardowskian roots, what is false. Woleński's proposal was developed recently by Marek Pokropski, who classifies Blaustein as an analytic phenomenologist. As he states, and I quote, "The originality of Blaustein's thinking is due to the fact that he synthesized, to some extent, two philosophical traditions, Twardowski's analytical philosophy, logical and conceptual analysis, and Husserlian phenomenology, description and analysis of acts of consciousness." Pokropski adds to Woleński's description that Blaustein connects methods used in both traditions. It is, he seems to link logical analysis with the phenomenological one. The former consists in analyzing concepts, whereas the latter is focused on consciousness. Though Pokropski's proposal is richer than Woleński's idea, it still seems to be partial. Pokropski clarifies that analytic phenomenology refers to the fact that Blaustein uses two methods, but this classification is inadequate since it does not address a specificity of Blaustein's philosophy. It has to be noted that in Blaustein's writings, logical analysis is rather marginal. It serves often as a preliminary and meta-philosophical tool to summarize some philosophical findings. Blaustein is interested rather in object-directed descriptions of concrete psychic phenomena. Moreover, the phrase analytic phenomenology, which is supposed to describe phenomenology that uses conceptual analysis, is misleading. Pokropski refers to a strict meaning of the term analysis, which reduces analysis to logical and conceptual studies. If this is the case, the phrase analytic phenomenology falls into the contradictio in adjecto fallacy, since it suggests that a philosopher should use a method inadequate to analyze phenomena. Pokropski notices that the idea to comprehend Blaustein as analytic phenomenologist comes from Violetta Mickiewicz. You have longer quotation from Mickiewicz at the display. Contrary to Pokropski, Mickiewicz does not connect Blaustein with Twardowski's analytic method, understood as logical and conceptual analysis. At most, Mickiewicz includes Blaustein's philosophy into the tradition of early descriptive phenomenology, called by her analytic phenomenology interchangeably, which is focused on the question of the source and value of knowledge. The key insight of this tradition, according to Mickiewicz, consists in putting an emphasis on intentionality. Phenomenology, thus understood, analyzes intentionality, and for this reason it is justified to call it analytic phenomenology. I think that Mickiewicz's description is more adequate, since it places Blaustein in the right context of the Bretonnian tradition. Thus, if the phrase analytic phenomenology is useful at all in the context of Blaustein, it should refer to the tradition of descriptive psychology. Given this, Blaustein is a member of the psychological trend of the Lvov-Warsaw school. Indeed, some scholars, for example, Teresa Rzepa, locate Blaustein's philosophy in the third period of the development of the psychological trend of the Lvov-Warsaw school, which covers the years 1920-1939. During this period, Twardowski students developed their original projects. I think that Mickiewicz's proposal to include Blaustein into the tradition of analytic phenomenology, it is the tradition which is rooted in Brentano's psychology, is adequate to read his original theory and, more importantly, to understand his polemic against Ingarden's method. Let me look closer at this aspect of the Blaustein-Ingarden discussion. Part 2, two phenomenologies are controversial with the method. The project of descriptive psychology rooted in Brentano and developed by Twardowski was an important point of reference for Blaustein. Descriptive psychology is the source for Blaustein's understanding of the object of philosophy as psychic phenomena, or for his emphasis on the introspective procedure as the basis of his method. It can be argued that the controversy over the method, descriptive psychology or phenomenology, is an adequate framework for defining Blaustein's position within the tradition of early phenomenology in Poland, as well as within the psychological trend of the Lvov-Warsaw school. The most developed critique of eidetic phenomenology one finds in two talks given by Blaustein in 1928 in April and May on the meetings of the Polish Philosophical Society. The full text of both talks is lost, but one can follow main arguments while reading two reports published later in Ruch Filozoficzny, the philosophical movement journal. By phenomenology, Blaustein understands a descriptive method used to analyze ideal essences of lived experiences. Yet, Blaustein asks, how does one understand the ideal essence here? For him, if one comprehends an essence as a general object, one falls into a series of problems. In the first of his talks, Blaustein discusses 5 charges in a more detail. Because of the time limits, I will not discuss these arguments here. They are displayed right now. Let me only note that Blaustein's arguments can be summarized as follows. Phenomenology, at least in its eidetic formulation, falls into the petitio principii fallacy. If one would confront Husserl with Blaustein's arguments, either with his logical investigations or with Ideas 1, they seem to be unjustified. Blaustein is wrong in claiming that an essence is comprehended by Husserl as a hypostasis of the general object. Moreover, his description of the way of givenness of an object in intuition is inadequate. One can go even a step further to claim that Blaustein, in fact, misreads Husserl. The basic disagreement between both philosophers lies in the fact that Blaustein does not accept the method of phenomenological reduction. After all, reduction makes the question of existence neutral. Husserl simply suspends the question, whereas Blaustein asks again and again about the existence of essences. So, if Blaustein does not criticize Husserl here, one can still argue that he discusses with a certain interpretation of the phenomenological method, namely with the interpretation which comprehends essences as existing general objects. In the secondary literature, this reading was formulated by Kuliniak and others. They claim that Blaustein's lectures were in fact directed toward Ingarden. Its aim was to weaken the position of phenomenology after Ingarden's return to Lvov. It can be argued that Blaustein's critique of both eidetic intuition and the thesis about the existence of ideal essences aims, in fact, at Ingarden and his concept of phenomenology. For Ingarden, phenomenology is understood as the analysis of the content of ideas due to the act of direct seeing essences, immanente Wesen Erschauung. This concept is elaborated in two parts article, The Aims of Phenomenologists, originally published in 1919. Of course, Ingarden's concept of ideas is not fully clear, and for this reason it can be interpreted in a few ways. In any case, one finds in Ingarden's text a Platonic account of ideas as ideal objects. As he insists, these objects do not exist either in time nor in a real space. As such, they are unchangeable. According to Ingarden, the cognition of ideal essences is not ontologically neutral. Rather, in the act of seeing essences, one states the ideal existence of relevant general objects. As it seems, Blaustein did never accept the view of ideas as existent, and on many occasions he attacked Ingarden's concept of essences. For example, in mentioned by Alexandra 3 reviews of Ingarden's Das literarische Kunstwerk. In this regard, he claimed that one has to use Occam's razor and in consequence to exclude the existence of general objects. To sum up this part of my paper, it can be noted that the above presented critique of eidetic procedures enables one to understand both approaches, Blaustein and Ingarden, as two readings of phenomenology. The former, Blaustein, argued that, and I quote, phenomenology is possible only as an empirical descriptive science of types, the lower genera, of experiences in pure consciousness, not as an a priori descriptive science of higher essences as ideal objects, end of quotation. For Blaustein, then, phenomenology is a form of descriptive psychology. By contrast, Ingarden understood phenomenology as the study of the content of ideas. Even if one can be justified in claiming that both philosophers were proponents of two different concepts of phenomenology, empirical, Blaustein, and eidetic, Ingarden, it is also true that these concepts have a common ground. It is they aim at describing the ways of how objects are given in experience. Part 3, sensations in experience. As shown, Blaustein does not accept Ingarden's eidetic method. Nonetheless, he refers to Ingarden's theory of consciousness, more precisely to his view of sensations as alien to the ego. Yet this reference, fully expressed in Blaustein's doctoral dissertation, is not clear. Of course, he does not quote, as Alexandra said, in early writings of Blaustein, there are no quotations from Ingarden. The theory, however, is the cornerstone of Blaustein's own account of lived experiences. In the end, as we will see in the present part of my talk, the theory provides a decisive argument against Husserl's theory of content. Additionally, the theory determines the direction of Blaustein's further investigations into aesthetic experience as focused on sensations. Blaustein's dissertation is divided into three main parts. At the beginning, Blaustein summarizes the development of the content theory from Bolzano to Twardowski. In this regard, he defines problems inherent in these early theories. Next, in the second part of the book, he attempts to show in what sense these early problems determine Husserl's theory of content, which, according to Blaustein, addresses these early difficulties. Finally, in the third part of the book, he defines limitations of Husserl's solution. Because of the time limits, let me only note that for Blaustein, Husserl accepts the basic idea that an act contains parts which are immanent or real parts of lived experiences. But Husserl comprehends an act wider than Bolzano and Twardowski. In his phenomenology, an act is divided into two inseparable parts, quality and matter. Quality is here an equivalent to Bolzano's subjective idea or presentation, and to Twardowski's act. Quality determines a relevant act as a presentation, a judgment, etc. Matter, in turn, refers to Bolzano's objective idea or presentation and to Twardowski's view of content. In spite of these advantages, Husserl's theory of content leads to other difficulties. Blaustein's criticism is directed mainly towards the thesis that sensations seem to be real parts of lived experiences. It is so since, for Husserl, sensations are lived through, whereas the objects are at least perceived. It is so since, for Husserl, yes, and objects are perceived. According to this view, the object or its parts are correlated with the immanent parts of the act. More precisely, they are correlated with a color sensation. Next, this part is grasped or apprehended in perception. By doing so, according to Blaustein, Husserl differentiates a color, which is a trait of the object, and a color, which is the content of consciousness. Nonetheless, as Blaustein holds, Husserl's description is inadequate since sensations are not an immanent part of the act. Sensations are rather experienced than lived through. The argument to justify his thesis Blaustein borrows from Ingarden. In his 1921 text on the danger of petitio principii in the theory of knowledge, Ingarden holds that, and I quote, sense data are contents which are different than conscious acts, and they, in themselves, are not conscious. This means that the way of its existence is being experienced, but not being lived through. End of quotation. Of course, the question of how Ingarden does understand sense data or sensations is challenging, especially in regard to the problem of the cognition of its existential status. Yet, from a phenomenological point of view, sensations are experienced in a different way, as, for example, intentional thoughts. Sensations are passive. The subject does not produce sensations, but rather they are imposed on the subject. Ingarden and Blaustein describe this aspect of experiencing sensations as being alien to the ego, ich-fremd. They both use the German word ich-fremd. Precisely for this reason, sensations are not immanent or real parts of lived experiences. They are placed rather at the peripheries of consciousness. Yet, as Ingarden claims, their way of existence in the form of experiencing experiencing them is a lived experience. This means that sensations are non-immanent parts which are correlated with immanent contents, which in turn are lived through. According to Blaustein, the content arises due to apprehension of sensations. Conclusion. The aim of the paper was the presentation of these elements of Blaustein's philosophy, which follow from his polemic with Ingarden and the critique of his approach. Besides elements which show that Blaustein tried to break with Ingarden's philosophy, I attempted to indicate clear continuations of some motives presented in Ingarden's thought. While exploring Ingarden's influences on Blaustein, I wanted to examine the question of Ingarden's position in the context of the Lvov-Warsaw school. As shown in the first part of my talk, Blaustein represented a psychological trend of the Lvov-Warsaw school. Given all presented intertwined connections between Ingarden's philosophy and Blaustein's project, one can ask whether these influences resulted in the revision of the trend. After all, also Husserl's phenomenology was developed as a critique of Brentano's psychologism. In this context, it is worth mentioning that in his preface to the Polish edition in the translation of Das literarische Kunstwerk, also quoted by Alexandra, Ingarden appreciated the importance of Blaustein's attempts to develop his aesthetic theory. Nonetheless, according to Ingarden, Blaustein stayed under strong influences of Twardowski, and for this reason he had fallen into psychologism. Ingarden's charge is partly correct, since Blaustein, as shown in the second part of my talk, indeed offered to understand phenomenology as descriptive psychology. Furthermore, given the questionable view of the imaginative object, which is the direct and indirect object of the intentional relation at once, one can agree with Ingarden. Yet, it has to be noted that Blaustein did not use a naive concept of psychology which puts emphasis on the analysis of tokens of lived experiences. It seems that even if he did not use eidetic reduction or no transcendental reduction, he had accepted the need of a kind of the psychological reduction. These ideas in mind, I think that this was possible due to Ingarden's influences on Blaustein and on the Lvov-Warsaw school. All in all, the phenomenological revision of the psychological trend of the Lvov-Warsaw school lies in the redefinition of the object of descriptive psychology as the ways of givenness, and Blaustein in his later writings uses also German word Gegebenheitsweisen, so the ways of givenness of an object in experience instead of tokens of psychic life. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Witold. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think this problem of influence is a really difficult one because, in my opinion, there are no reliable sources of knowledge about somebody's influence on somebody else. For instance, even quotations. Sometimes we quote somebody not because we are influenced by this person, but just it is good to quote such a person, yeah. Or sometimes we are, for instance, forced to do it because the review of our person states that of our paper states that we should cite quotes or refer to the views of somebody. And the problem of reviews and what reviewers think and what they write was revealed by Peter Simons. You may look at this paper on Academia, and it reveals perfectly reviewers' intentions. Okay, so even if we ask somebody whether he was or she was influenced by somebody else, sometimes it happens that we are not aware of somebody's influence. So sometimes even our convictions about it are really erroneous. So the problem, many problems arises here. Okay, but let me open the discussion. Alexandra and Guillaume. Alexandra.
But I was not a first person, so.
So who was the first, Guillaume or Peter?
Okay.
Because I was thinking about the problem of influence so hardly that I didn't notice who was the first.
I have such an remark. I'm not sure that Blaustein was in Germany during summer trimester. Because I think that it was July and August of 1925. Yes, that's first. Second, it is very interesting thing to read Roman Ingarden's review of PhD thesis, Blaustein's PhD thesis. And Ingarden wrote that it's a work consists of 3 parts. First part is okay, and second and third it's not okay because Blaustein referred only to logische Untersuchungen, not to the Ideen. And that he doesn't understand of essence of consciousness, and that this concept of consciousness is from Brentano, and all problems are just all problems all problem find its solutions, and it's a second point. Yes, so when I was talking about influences, and it's my opinion, yes, that rather Ingarden rendered Blaustein a phenomenologist, and also Professor Czesław Głąbik, and also Professor Woleński, and also Professor Miśkiewicz, yes, that he was rendered a phenomenologist. It is the same case with some linguistic. Zygmunt Łępicki. It was the same case that Ingarden rendered Łępicki the phenomenologist, and many scholars just do the same. So I'm very skeptic about that influence. Of course, I don't know how it was exactly in 30s. So I didn't study it. So I'm very astonished that Blaustein was present at seminars of Ingarden in 30s. I'm not sure he really was there, because I have no time to read all documents in Krakow because of a pandemic. but it's not evident, and because of this, I know this or problem with priority. After yes, I'm not sure. Sometimes I think that it was only the name of Blaustein just written at the document, that he was present at seminars 1935, 1936, but I didn't research it yet. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. The last point, this is Ingarden's explicit report that Blaustein participated in his seminars, and they discussed many topics. But of course, he arrived in Freiburg indeed in July. It's a very interesting story how he was introduced to go to Germany, because Ingarden started his job in 1925. So he didn't have occasion to meet personally Blaustein. And there is a letter of Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz to Ingarden, where he explicitly asks Ingarden to help Blaustein, to introduce Blaustein to Husserl. And indeed, he has sent a letter, but letters of Ingarden to Husserl are lost, unfortunately. But there are letters of Husserl to Ingarden from the end of June that I will be very happy to welcome Blaustein in Freiburg, and later in 26 and in the 30s. There are two other letters of Husserl, who writes that his memories of Blaustein is very good. He was a very good person. So please greet Blaustein for me. He was there for sure. Of course, the review of Ingarden, the second question, it's devastating. I agree, but this is, an Orthodox student of Husserl reads a book, the very first book written on Husserl in Polish, and I think that he was quite jealous that he didn't write the book, and he devastated. But in my opinion, to read Blaustein's interpretation of Husserl, one should refer to Brentano and to Twardowski. Even this idea to read Husserl in the context of Bolzano, it comes directly from Twardowski. So to introduce Bolzano as the missing link to understand the content theory in 19th century and at the beginning of 20th century. So if we read Blaustein's dissertation not as an exegesis of Husserl, but as a Brentanian interpretation of Husserl, I think it's quite interesting. And of course, Ingarden's charges hold. But again, this is external view of this work. So of course, the third question, whether is it justified to call him a phenomenologist or not, this is a huge question. And I think, of course, this is only a label. And at least in my research, I want to present those topics, those concepts, ideas, and propositions of solution of some problems, which can show that there is a very clear phenomenological dimension of Blaustein's philosophy. So, for example, this idea of ways of givenness, this Gegebenheitsweisen, this is not at all Twardowskian concept. This is not Brentanian concept. This is phenomenological concept, and he uses this concept in his talk he gave in Paris in 1937. And there is this text is written in German, and he uses this term. I think that this was simply the time where when descriptive psychology was not so popular at all, and simply Blaustein and others members of the psychological trend, they tried to find other ways to explicate or to describe experience, and phenomenology was one of the options. So when he arrived in Paris, for him, by the way, Ingarden was present in Paris at that time as well, because this was the huge aesthetic congress. Of course, Ingarden went there to track how his own thought is regarded by international readers, but this is another story. Once
Okay,
again,
thank you for this intensive discussion.
Thank you very much.
We still have two persons that wanted to take part in the discussion, Guillaume and Peter.
Well, thanks, Witold. It was very informative. Was always very curious about Blaustein, but since my knowledge of Polish is absolutely minimal, so I have to rely on other scholars. But it was very good and informative. So thank you. There's one thing I didn't really get, and perhaps it's because Blaustein didn't really get it also, is this point that you mentioned a couple of times, that when Husserl talks about sensation, according to Blaustein, it would be wrong because sensations are not lived through, but are experienced. I find it, I mean, if it's not a matter of words, what is it about? Is it about intentionality? Of course, as Husserl says, sensations are not intentional. Or is it about experience? But I mean, durchleben, erleben, that's more or less the same thing for me. So that's my first point. My second point is, so well, that was in your conclusion, focusing on the ways of givenness instead of tokens of psychic life. I mean, descriptive psychology, even in Brentano's sense, is not about tokens of psychic life. I mean, it's about, so you hear some accord, some Zusammenklang of three tones, and then you analyze this experience. Is there fusion? Is there Verschmelzung or not? What you analyze is not the token. Of course, I mean, you take the token, but you want to make a general assertion about not the token of one sound, but of this kind of sound in general. I mean, otherwise descriptive psychology would be pure psychologism, and it's not the case. Yeah, well, that's it. Thanks.
thank you for this very accurate question. Maybe I will start with sensations. I remember our exchange a few years ago. This was a huge problem, and I find that this problem strictly connected to Ingarden's philosophy. And if you refer to Ingarden's memories of Edmund Husserl, for example, or his lectures from Oslo on Husserl of Ingarden, or his lectures, the last public lecture given in Krakow, before his death, he referred on many occasions to the problem how to understand sensations. And I agree with you that sensations are, of course, not intentional, of course. But the question is whether they are, this is ontological question, whether they are parts of consciousness or not. And in Husserl, in Logische Untersuchungen, Husserl accepts the solution that sensations are not intentional, but they are non-intentional parts of lived experiences. And Ingarden notices that in 1918, while talking with Husserl, he posed a question, where are sensations? And Husserl said, you know, sensation, they are not flying around us. They are not in the world. They are somehow, they are parts of our consciousness. And the idea of this Ich-Fremd, of course, this Erleben, Durchleben, you can refer in this context to Scheller, but Ingarden himself refers to Konrad Martius. And he claims that the idea of sensations which are ich-fremd falls from Konrad Martius and her ontology of the word. So, but the direction of his argumentation is to justify later, and I didn't talk during this talk. Blaustein's thesis is that sensations, if they are not parts of consciousness, so they are parts of so-called phenomenal world. And this is a huge challenge to interpret this phenomenal world in a non-naive way. So I will skip this now. And the second question of Gegebensheimweise, in the conclusion, I didn't use the term descriptive psychology. I use only naive concept of psychology, so much broader. I know, of course, that descriptive psychology is not about tokens, but this was, I think, one of the charges against Blaustein from other members of the Lvov-Warsaw school, the psychological trend, I mean, Witwicki, who was at that time a professor of psychology in Warsaw. And many of students of Witwicki attacked Blaustein that he is only obsessed by psychic life of Leopold Blaustein and not about psychic life as such. But my point in the conclusion was that, for example, the question of sensation is very useful in this context, because the question of how you experience or live through. So the question is of how. So about Gegebenheit, Weiss, how the object is given, how sensations are given in experience. And this is, but there is another very interesting clue. I think it can be interesting for all Brentano scholars, because in Ingarden's lectures on Brentano, there is also a clue to find this fallacy, how to understand sensation directly in Brentano. In his lectures on Brentano, Ingarden said that when sensations are not strictly differentiated from what is experienced, they seem to be physical phenomena, and for this reason they cannot be included in psyche. And maybe, but you know, the question, I agree that the question of influences is very fluid in this context, but maybe simply this was somehow present in Lvov at that time, that they discussed the status of sensations. And in my opinion, even if you refer to Karl Stumpf and his idea of Erscheinungswelt, what simply seems to be the phenomenal world in Blaustein. So there are many connections which have to be solved in this context. But once again, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And the last person, Peter Simons.
Thank you. I was very pleased to learn that Blaustein rejected both the transcendental and the eidetic reductions. When I hear the word essence, I reach for my dictionary. And when I hear the word transcendental, I reach for my revolver. But you mentioned at the end that Blaustein performed or did something which you called the psychological reduction. And I have no idea what that is. So could you explain, please?
I use the term to address the question, what is the object researched by a descriptive psychologist? Is it only an exemplary experience, or rather we can we can do research on some general features, traits of experiences as such. And this idea to call this methodological procedure arises from the discussion of Blaustein with one of Witwicki's students, Irena Filozofovna, who attacked Ingarden, and she claimed that what Ingarden is writing about, what Blaustein is writing about is only his own psychic life. For this reason, to verify Blaustein's description is to refer to my own experience and say, no, this is false because I experience in a different way. And in reply to this charge, Blaustein claims that in his description, he believes that he's not describing only his own subjective experience, but some general structures. And this I mean by this methodological step. So in defining the object of research, not subjective exemplary experience, but rather general structures of this experience, I mean by psychological reduction.